Alright, hey y'all. So today we're going to jump into In the Shadow of the Silent Majorities, or the End of the Social. So this is the text that follows Simulacra Simulation. Came out in the same year, or no, not quite. It was a couple of years after. So in 1983, at least that's how it's credited at the beginning of the book here. So one of the guiding questions for this book, because it deals specifically with the role of the media play in crafting, shaping this thing called the masses, one of the guiding questions I'd like to pose is, what comes first? Is it that the masses inform the media, which then reaffirms the existence of such masses, or is it the other way around? In what way do these two things come into being? Because oftentimes, reading Baudrillard's work, you kind of lose sight of some of these types of questions that, without asking, we kind of passively just accept some of the rather outlandish things he says, which I'm all for, but, let's try and be a little bit analytic about this. I know that's a scary word, but in this context, I think it'll serve us. It'll serve us well. And I'm not saying I have an answer to this question, but going through this text, we'll see if we can sift out any possible, foray or approach to an answer. So this text starts out with the following passage. The whole chaotic constellation of the social revolves around that spongy referent, that opaque but equally translucent reality, that nothingness, the masses. Okay, so conceiving of this thing called the social, I believe that this is taking specifically from Hannah Arendt, and her thesis in The Human Condition, that there was something of a dissipation of the distinction between the public and the private realms in favor of this sort of social realm that saw the blending of the two, in a sense, to be really quick about it. So here we're dealing with that idea of the social. So in what way then, and I will propose an answer, in what way then does the social manifest itself? And for Baudrillard here, it's really in the most exaggerated form we can think of, the media, and the relationship it has to the masses. The dissemination of information to such an insane degree sort of, is the most extreme version of this thing called the social. So there's an interesting translator's note on the first page, where in the French, Baudrillard kind of moves between two terms to designate the masses. For him, there's la masse, but then there's also faire masse, so faire, to do, masse just being like substance. So these terms can be used, interchangeably, these phrases, where mass can both signify like a group of people, like a mass of employees, a mass of workers, but it can also mean just like a substance. So if you have a mass of, mud. Don't know why that was my example, but you can have a mass in that way. So when Baudrillard uses it, it's sort of, it's a little bit playful, because he at the same time as he's kind of crafting this discourse around what the masses are, he wants to recognize their sort of facelessness, how they are ultimately just a substance, just a sort of mound of a homogeneous type material or substance. So following Arendt, where in The Human Condition she has that one passage that says that in the social realm, or in that sort of folding together or disappearance of the distinction between the private and the public, she states that there can be no more greatness, in a sense. You can't have an Achilles in the social realm. So it is in that way that Baudrillard's seeing a sort of banality creep in. So for him, they are neither, that is the masses, they are neither good conductors of the political nor good conductors of the social, nor even conductors of meaning in general. Everything flows through them. They are simply that which, I guess, absorbs while refracting, where everything that hits it passes through it, not necessarily at the level of content, where let's say there was, and we're dealing in very general terms here, at the level of content where, let's say, in the media sphere, one person, there's some kind of catastrophic event somewhere on the globe, and 95% of people watching, the masses, do not in themselves take it, or do not take it upon themselves to do anything or react in terms of that very content itself. But in very many ways, it is that kind of involvement or a sort of cathartic commitment to the emotional response that is induced or that is elicited in them by those very messages. So the distinction can be made then, or no distinction can be made between media events, precisely because they are, in their very fabrication, designed to elicit that response. So there is sort of a nullification. They are rendered sort of mute, where a soccer match or football is something that can induce the exact same response, yet it is something that also elicits a sort of apathy, because it is not so much what is going on, but how that going on is distributed and placed into the minds of the masses that is fascinating. And this has been coming for a while now. Baudrillard is very clear that this is not something that stands necessarily radically opposed to this this project of the social that has been going on for a while, as we can think of it through our end, but is really approaching, I'm going to say endpoint reluctantly, but it's approaching its kind of terminal velocity. It's, I guess, final moments in the course of this thing called sociality. Now, Baudrillard's homogenization of this thing called the masses, which for him is always already a homogenized entity, really, this point in his career, I think, was really the straw that broke the camel's back, because for a little background info, he earned his PhD in sociology. So he was, when he was saying these kinds of things, that the people are simply, a homogeneous mass, what that effectively did was he marginalized himself from his colleagues, where there was these Foucauldian attempts to really understand how power works in specific circles, and there were people taking Foucault's thought, as just one example, to apply to various social groups. Baudrillard was not so quick in saying that there is this thing called the social, or there is this thing called like a group mentality or anything like that outside of the homogenized mass, but rather he wanted to look at the way in which our relation to the spectacle of the media was in itself a force that resisted any such, I guess, molecular sort of development. So for him, sociology can only depict the expansion of the social and its vicissitudes. The reabsorption, the implosion of the social escapes it. The hypothesis of the death of the social is also that of its own death. Where now we are seeing that precisely in this thing called the mass and its relationship to the media, that very death of the social, where there was at one point at least some ability to speak, to be heard, even if it was in a social realm that was that of banality. Now we are seeing the very death of that speech. So we can think of this example of television, where for him there's nothing quite as absurd as a television being left on with no one in the room. Because for him that, well, it's not so much absurd, but it's illuminating, where it reveals to him that the television is totally indifferent to the person viewing, whereas a book can't read itself when it, and this is very, I don't want to be too like kind of platonic about this, but a book can't read itself. There must be someone present, some sort of individual that can absorb the messages being emitted from it, whereas that is not possible with the television or with the news as it presents itself in its spectacular form. So he elaborates then and states that there cannot be specific masses. So for him, to want to specify the term mass is a mistake. It is to provide meaning for that which has none. He goes on to say, one says the mass of workers, but the mass is never that of workers, nor of any other social subject or object. The peasant masses of old were not in fact masses. Only those form a mass who are freed from their symbolic bondage, released, only to be caught in infinite networks. So what does that mean? Well, we have to think back to symbolic exchange and death, where for him, this thing called the symbolic there is a militant desire to destroy it in favor of the structural law of value or the law of equivalence. So what that means is like kind of total operativity, where we're slowly destroying the possibility for change by, implementing these networks, implementing these strategies of understanding, of knowledge that crystallizes that which can be known and how things can be conducted. So it is for that reason that the masses are never those that exist prior to these networks, in his term, these infinite networks, but are rather that which can only exist within them. So when people are reduced to that status, are reduced to networks, or if we think back to his first book, when they are rendered those cyberneticians, those people that are masters of these very networks, precisely because they have to be. One of the strategies employed by the masses in the media is to see value, or to instill the idea that value is associated not with whatever message might be disseminated, but rather the very process of disseminating information, where information itself is the end goal. So as he states in another text, I think it's Fatal Strategies, I can't remember exactly, but it could be for critique, but sorry. He states that if one is to radically challenge the system, they must renounce information itself. So for him, as he states it here, the plan is always to get some meaning across, to keep the masses within reason, an imperative to produce meaning that takes the form of the constantly repeated imperative to moralize information, to better inform, to better socialize, to raise the cultural level of the masses, etc. Nonsense. The masses scandalously resist this imperative of rational communication. So he continues, messages are given to them. They only want some sign. They idolize the play of signs and stereotypes. They idolize any content so long as it resolves itself into a spectacular sequence. What they reject then is the dialectic of meaning. So this is an idea he expounds upon in Fatal Strategies, the sort of end of the dialectics. But for him, he gets very weary as soon as you have these sort of information campaigns that are in the service of better, moving towards like a more proper, a more effective way to be a political agent. So what it means to be a good person. He's very skeptical about that, because that would imply that there is that very idea of, progress. But at the same time, that people can just simply take on whatever information is given to them without, being able to critically evaluate it. Especially true today in the age of alternative facts. But to digress a little bit, there is a tendency over the past this 20, 30 years in the literature, for people to locate at every moment a sort of affirmation of Baudrillard's ideas. So there was Reagan. It wasn't Reagan, there was Bush. It wasn't Bush, it's Trump. But each of these moments, and what occurs is that people say, oh look, Baudrillard was right, or something of that, in that capacity. But for me, these things far precede that. So if you just read this text or Simulacra and Simulation, one might certainly get the impression that Baudrillard is just speaking to a time in which there are televisions, in which there is this thing called the media. But really, this is a process that has been ongoing for several centuries, and that has gotten to this point. But I think we are incorrect when we suddenly, or when we very strongly suggest that we can see Baudrillard's ideas affirmed in the present, which is true, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that there is a telos to this. It hasn't just sprung up like that. There has been something of a progression to this point. So for him, this comes out into the form of, or at least that situation today, in the form of the silent majorities. So the masses take on this sort of form. And we see here a sort of end of this thing called culture, which is a term that's had a very slippery history. But the way in which I sort of imagine what Baudrillard is saying about culture is that as it becomes, I guess, available via television screens, as it becomes available via the internet or anything like that, or by what artifacts we place in our houses, these cultural icons, what we see then is not an engagement with culture, but rather the consumption of it. There is more of an emphasis placed, there's a cat. There's more of an emphasis placed on one's ability to demonstrate their being cultured, as opposed to actually engaging with a certain culture. And this is highly emblematic of the West, that sees no limits. The West will go and walk all over Machu Picchu, or they'll go to Vietnam and completely absorb everything there without actually retaining that at the level of the culture. Not to say that can really happen, but that there seems to be less of an engagement in that sense, where white people really love to really love to travel, which is a really fascinating phenomenon in the context of this argument of the masses. So in kind of elaborating upon this telos to this phenomenon, Baudrillard states that when the political emerged during the Renaissance, it was at first only a pure game of signs, played on the absence of truth, as did later the worldly strategy of the Jesuits on the absence of God. And he goes on to continue to talk about Nietzsche, who well knew, it is in this disregard for a social, psychological, historical truth, in the exercise of simulacra as such, that the maximum of political energy is found, where the political is a game and is not yet given a reason. So it's that, thinking about Machiavelli, in what way is there a sort of mastery of signs required to master this political sphere? How there is something of a symbolic attachment to it. Now all this has dissipated, because thinking about information and the way that it's disseminated and what constitutes a good political body. And this is really indicative of the left. Not to say I'm opposed to that, I'm left as hell, but there is a tendency to dictate what a good person is, and there are rules around that, or rather laws almost, and they're in flux, and there is something of a game being played now, and we can't necessarily lose sight of the fact that when Baudrillard is talking about some sort of a loss, there are always the ruins of that which was apparently lost, or that which disappeared, that guide something of a symbolic order that is maintained today. So this shift occurred in the 18th century. So in the since the Revolution, that the political has taken a decisive turn. It took upon itself a social reference. The social invested it. Now this is culminated into that silent majority, or the masses, which is, for Baudrillard, an imaginary referent that does not mean they don't exist, however. It means that their representation is no longer possible. The masses are no longer a referent because they no longer belong to the order of representation. So this demands some kind of clarification, because when we think of Baudrillard, we think of simulation. When we think of simulation, we might automatically think of representation. Now, they're in the realm of the symbolic, or if we just think back to how he had just explained the political, where there was a demand for a sort of mastery of signs, a sort of play of signification, it is not as though Baudrillard is a critic of simulation or of representation per se. Rather, it can take on more than one form, some of which, I will say for now, just two forms, that of an oppressive simulation and that of a non-oppressive one. So the oppressive simulation is the one that does not see contradiction, that is totally operative, that is like, in his later work, the term that would come to supplant this would be integral reality, a sort of totally functional system. Whereas a non-oppressive simulation is one that recognizes that, of course, everyone is already embedded within simulation. It is how anyone presents themselves to anyone else in their appearance. It is the recognition of that which is then susceptible to change, to development, to anything of that sort. So when Baudrillard writes that the silent majorities are no longer representable, it means they have been solidified, crystallized in a form that they cannot escape from. And it is that form that has taken over completely that sort of non-oppressive simulation, or that non-oppressive representation that was susceptible to change, development, a sort of rhizomatic possibility. So in the wake of this sort of transition into the silent majorities, the system has mobilized certain strategies to convince people that they have not lost this sort of individuation in the form of one's own representation. So this is why, for Baudrillard, it seeks to reverse its strategies, from passivity to participation, from silence to speech. He continues, everywhere the masses are encouraged to speak, they are urged to live socially, electorally, organizationally, sexually, in participation, in festival, in free speech, etc. Now, all of these provide the illusion of a sort of reclaiming of that thing lost. But these are all just part of that very system. The system of information, especially the dissemination of information, where it does not come down to it at the form of content or at the level of content, but rather is all a part of the demonstration, of the spectacle of oneself. So in the case of sexuality, where pornography is probably the most searched thing on the internet at any given time, for Baudrillard that would mark not necessarily a sort of realization of sexual desire in the form of the possibility of the internet, but is rather a strategy evoked by the silent majorities to convince them of sexuality, to convince them of a thing called sexuality that is innately human, and that it is something that we have never lost. And we do that by compensating, by living through the hyper-real version of it. The case for subjectivity, however, in this sphere, so in the case of pornography, there is still a subject to some extent that engages with that individual moment, like the person typing up, whatever on the internet or anything. So for Baudrillard addresses this, and he states that the mass realizes that paradox of being both an object of simulation, it only exists at the point of convergence of all the media waves which depict it, while simultaneously being a subject of simulation, capable of refracting all the models and of emulating them by hypersimulation. So it's in this way that we are sort of entering, it's sort of post-human subjectivity. Now what that'll necessarily look like is interesting because by engaging with Baudrillard's work from like start to finish, it's difficult to say whether or not he wants to totally crush the system, say there's, we're screwed, there's no possible way out of this, or if he wants to sort of see the possibility behind it, where he states, well, he doesn't state this explicitly, but he wants to consider the possibilities that are made possible by this very transition, by this system. So for instance, he's very clear in denouncing the apathy of the masses, and for me, I think he wants to see more political engagement, but a political engagement that is cautious of the extent to which it is informed not by a sort of proper content, not by the spectacle of content, but by an actual proper content, by real opinions, whatever that'll look like. And that's we get into some kind of dangerous territory there. But he does denounce apathy generally. So for those people that think, Baudrillard's just a cynic, pessimistic, like there's no hope, we're all screwed, I wouldn't be so quick to say that. I think that there are many points in which he lays out a sort of strategy of resistance. It's difficult to see at times, but I think it's there, and I think it's important to consider that. So in the case of a thing like a survey, which you take some time to elaborate on, that is supposed to take the opinions, beliefs, or whatever of those masses or of those people, there are still subjects on the one end, filling in surveys or whatever. But any sort of result that you get in this system does not reflect some kind of true opinion or belief or whatever, but is just the media speaking through the masses. So whatever ideas permeate in the media spheres, and I'm not just referring to like CNN or Fox or anything like that, but in that very radiating mystique of information itself, what we see then is the affirmation not of a real human opinion, but of the semblance of it, of, I guess, the simulation of there being this thing called an opinion. At no time for Baudrillard are the masses politically or historically engaged in a conscious manner. They have only ever done so out of perversity and complete irresponsibility. And this is like, the collective unconscious, sort of groupthink that is very, very messed up and has a very terrible history. But it is only in those forms, the very oppressive forms, does Baudrillard see there having been some kind of political engagement. These masses, or the silent majorities, know then, for Baudrillard, that there is no liberation, and that a system is abolished only by pushing it into a hyperlogic, by forcing it into an excessive practice which is equivalent to a brutal amortization. So it's like there are two possibilities for Baudrillard. There's either complete collapse, where a system is totally driven to its destruction, which would have pretty negative effects for this thing called the human, or we will see this total functional operativity, in the form of like Foucault's carceral state, total surveillance, total self-surveillance, total control. And it's difficult to know which one will take over which in Baudrillard here, because, like I stated, he does kind of sway between these two possibilities and what he thinks will actually arise. Now, there is something that stands radically opposed to the masses in some form, and that is terrorism. So Baudrillard's relationship to this thing called terrorism has gotten him in some trouble. People think, like, are you siding with the enemy? Where he doesn't want to just say that terrorists have no logic, or they're just, messed up people who want to see the world burn. He thinks that they correspond to they are a response to an oppressive system. So for him, terrorism claims to really aim at capital, so global imperialism, etc., but it mistakes its enemy, and in doing so, aims at its true enemy, which is the social. So he goes on, terrorism does not aim at making anything speak, at resuscitating or mobilizing anything. This is in opposition to the media. It has no revolutionary consequences in this regard. It is rather a complete counter-performance for which it is violently reproached. But that isn't its game. It aims at the masses in their silence, a silence mesmerized by information. It aims at the white magic of the social encircling us, that of information, of simulation, of deterrence, of anonymous and random control, in order to precipitate its death by accentuating it. So it's for that reason, or because it represents that sort of position, that it stands opposed to the masses, because it does not ascribe to the logic of the masses. It is something that speaks, yet makes a spectacle. So in that way, it is, of course, part of that very media system, but it's sort of and this is how it drives the system to its logical conclusion, is that it is more of what the media is. Rather than simply negating it, it works in its performance. Or we can look at this another way, and he proposes that it is the only non-representative act. In this regard, it has an affinity with the masses, who are the only non-representable reality, because it doesn't have it's not a representable act, because it does not correspond to the logic of the dissemination of information, right? It's not clean. It's not ready to be consumed. It's something that is very dissonant, something that's very jarring, and that does not allow the comfort of the masses to continually be in that sort of position. It kind of wrests them out of it, makes them scared, paranoid, which, today I would go so far as to say that is in itself part of the very system. We like to make people scared, because then they consume, George Bush's thing, like, don't forget everyone, keep shopping in the wake of, following 9/11. So terrorism, in the act of taking hostages, plays on the lack of representability of the masses. So those people, innocent people that don't deserve this, when they are taken hostage, it is not as though they are stripped of an identity, because for Baudrillard that identity is already lost. That identity is gone in the wake of this the silent majorities. So in that way, it almost makes the terrorist act that loss of a face apparent, right? By bringing it to its extreme form in that very loss. So it's in that way that terrorism, by not simply negating the system, as I've stated, but working within the parameters of the oppressiveness of that very system, points to the very limits of it, and drives it, I guess, slowly to its possible destruction. This lack of a face, or this sort of death, is how Baudrillard places it, or says it, and makes, or sort of reverses the notion that the social is something that is dissipating, that it's approaching its own death in the form of the masses, because since it is already the accumulation of death. In effect, we are in a civilization of the super social, and simultaneously in a civilization of non-degradable, indestructible residue, piling up as the social spreads. So this sort of post-socialness is really the social to the nth power, driven to be more than itself, to continually circumvent its limits, to absorb every single point that stands opposed to it, in the form of rendering it spectacle, rendering it, putting things in museums, making it consumable on the mass media, or anything of that sort. Now I'll skip a bit because one of the following chapters, the implosion of meaning in the media, appeared in Simulacra and Simulation. So if you've read that, then you've already read this one. And this happens often in Baudrillard's work, where chapters will reappear. Because many times his works were edited, so it's important to notice if a text is actually written by him, or if it is simply an edited text. So like Screened Out compiles a bunch of different essays that appear at different points in different texts. The Conspiracy of Art has some essays that appear in other places. The Vital Illusion, same thing. So if anyone's trying to get through all Baudrillard's works, don't be surprised if you see essays sprout up again. And it can be kind of a sign of relief, because you like want to get through a book and you realize, oh wow, I read the last 2 chapters already, and then jump through. Not to say you should be excited about not having to read, but yeah, it feels good. So the final chapter is called Our Theater of Cruelty. Now this chapter was one of my first forays into Baudrillard's work back in my undergrad, and it's not easy, because really a lot of this stuff is difficult to engage with on its own. So he starts out with this, the first section in this chapter titled Mogadishu. So the event that Baudrillard is referring to in Mogadishu was with Lufthansa Flight 181 that had been taken over by 4 members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who called themselves Commando Martyr Halima. I'm getting this nice description off of Wikipedia. That was taken over by, I guess, the Baudrillard gang. So what had occurred was, it's a pretty long story. These people take over the plane. However, in the end, the German army, after the plane landed in one of the cities, Mogadishu, the police got in there, successfully saved the hostages in a rather kind of exaggerated or spectacular rescue mission that was very risky, and that got the whoever called the order into some heat because of the risk they were taking. So of this event, a terrorist event par excellence, Baudrillard says that it is not terrorism that is the violence. It is only the spectacle it unleashes that is truly violent. So it is for him our theater of cruelty, the only one that remains to us, perhaps equal in every respect to that of Artaud or to that of the Renaissance, and extraordinary, in that it brings together the spectacular and the challenge at their highest points. So what occurs in the spectacle is not the victory, of course not the victory of the terrorists, but actually a reversion, where the opposite is accomplished by the terrorists. They have encouraged, for Baudrillard, inordinately the sacred union of all the world forces of repression. They have reinforced the political order, etc. Let's go all the way. They have killed their Stammheim comrades, since if they had not launched and then botched up this operation, the others would still be living. So Bader and Stammheim demand a little bit. Who are these people? And I'll explain. So these people were referred to as the Bader-Meinhof group. So this is all from Wikipedia because it explains it the most concisely. So they were a West German far-left militant organization founded in 1970. So the key figures were Andreas Bader and Ulrich Meinhof. So Ulrich Meinhof was involved in Bader's escape from jail in 1970, the West government, as well as most Western media and literature, considered the Red Army faction to be a terrorist organization. So what happened was, in the case of Baudrillard, he was sent to prison, and it is believed, or at least what the story was that he killed himself in prison. However, some people have come to think that it was actually the police that killed him there. So this was in Stammheim prison. So that's what Baudrillard is referring to when he says that they have killed their Stammheim comrades. So it's in that way that there is that sort of eradication of contradiction, of opposition in the spectacular, portrayal of the triumph of the police in the wake of this terrorist act. Now with this event, or with the conspiracy around it, Baudrillard is very weary. So in Stammheim, with the people who are, believed to have committed suicide, Baudrillard resists the idea that if the masses just knew the truth, if there was a truth, let's say the German police did kill Baudrillard and his comrades, that for Baudrillard would not mean that there would be a sudden an awakening by the people, a sort of enlightenment. But rather for Baudrillard, there is no difference. For him, it's really just a load of rubbish. A death is romantic or it is not. So he states that we know that the German state, right, is a fascist entity just like any state in itself. And it is in that capacity that it does not matter. And we cannot get caught up on these individual circumstances that purport to reveal a sort of truth. Because that's what we invest our energy in, and that's what the masses like these instances of truth, so they can sit back, let it wash over them, and not affect them in any way. So even that resistance to the German state in the unlawful deaths of Baudrillard and his comrades, for Baudrillard, that opposition is in itself part and parcel of that very system that relies on a discourse of truthfulness, of reason, of information that is only ever repressive. So it's not as though there can be some sort of beneficial information. There can't be proper information, because it is information itself that is oppressive. So that gets pretty well to the end there. This is a nice book here, and there's a lot more. It's kind of repetitive, but there are some important things to consider here, especially the role of terrorism, which Baudrillard will elaborate on in the next book I do, which would be Fatal Strategies, and the role that terrorism plays. And essentially the thesis that he puts forth is that he does not fear, it's not so much a thesis but an opinion, he does not fear terrorism nearly as much as he fears a state capable of eradicating it, which is an idea that you say that today and people's brains explode. Because for him, terrorism is the remnants of a sort of opposition that has been lost. So as we have seen in his earlier texts, Marxism is just one example, or Foucault, for instance, of Foucauldian analysis. These are things that feed into the system, that work within it. So of course, to some extent, terrorism does the exact same thing, as I've demonstrated, or as I've presented here. But it is something that stands opposed to it. It is something that is more radically opposed to the system. Now, whether or not it's actually effective at that is, up for debate. And I'm sure anyone else would know more about that than me, or at least would have an interesting idea regarding that. But on that note, really, for anyone that checked this one out, I hope you enjoyed it. I did. I've gone through this book 2 or 3 times now. It's good stuff. It's complicated stuff for sure. But I hope I was able to clear anything up. But if not, and anyone has some beef with that, you know how to leave it. And I guess I'll check you out next time. Take care.